Today on the show, I'm thrilled to welcome Hans Zeiger, president of the Jack Miller Center. Hans is a former Washington state legislator who helped pass a civics graduation requirement, but also a historian, author, and one of the leading voices working to revive the teaching of America's founding principles and history in our schools and universities across the U.S. Through the Jack Miller Center, he's helped thousands of educators bring the ideas, documents, and stories that built our country back into the classroom, especially as we are celebrating America's 250th anniversary. We talked about the state of the civic education, why it matters now more than ever, and what all of us, teachers, parents, and citizens, can do to help fix it. I hope you guys enjoyed today's conversation. Hans, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Peter.
So, what got you started with American political history and just politics? Was there a person or a book or a teacher that kind of put you on this trajectory?
Well, my mom took me to the Puyallup Public Library in Puyallup, Washington, every week when I was a little kid. And so I just got in the habit of checking out books, and we would take books home to read. I think I was about 5 years old, and I checked out a book about the presidents of the United States, and I was just fascinated by, these guys who had served our country in that way, and the kind of what I could pick up about their career trajectories and their lives. And so the school librarian at my elementary school eventually started like ordering presidential biographies for the school library, and I would just devour those. I love presidential history. I started a presidential history collection. I entered it in the local fairgrounds, as an exhibit during the fair, and was fascinated by that. But really stayed at that kind of level. Wasn't really all that in tune with the history of my own local community. And it was when I got back from college, I started grad school, and my grad school roommates and I um, were watching the Band of Brothers series and their interviews with the real world veterans of the European campaign at the beginning of those episodes. And it just struck me, wow, there's this narrow window of opportunity. This was back in 2007 to talk to members of the World War II generation. And I need to do that. And so I went back to my hometown, Puyallup, Washington, over winter break. And I just started talking to a few veterans who I knew, and they put me in touch with other veterans, ended up talking to about 120 veterans and friends and family of people who were killed in the war. And people who were interned, Japanese Americans who were interned in the local fairgrounds. And it was just a remarkable, life-changing experience to talk to these people who had experienced the war. Everybody, as you know, having written a similar book, put together a similar project for your hometown in New Jersey. So that was just not only transformational for my understanding of the history of that time period and of my hometown, but also really informed the public service that I undertook as a state legislator for a decade, starting in 2011, a short time in local government after that, and now leading a nonprofit focused on civics and history. Having that deep understanding of how history impacts people's lives and how we are, informs the fact that we are, in fact, living through history right now and can shape the future through our acts, and that we're going to be better off if we have that rich understanding of history.
It's interesting to touch upon this idea of local history being something that we could all essentially start with. We could all be historians, right? Everybody that's listening to this could go and ask somebody a question. You could volunteer at a local museum. You could volunteer at a library. Can you speak to this idea of local history being extremely important and like a good starting point, I guess, for people preserving history, but also that kind of their civic duty as well?
Yeah, I think human beings are wired to um, attach to particular places and particular communities, and we need families and friends who can help us through life, and where we can feel like we have some responsibility for the well-being of the people around us. and understanding that we're not just sort of in this moment, but that we're connected to people who've come before us, and that in fact we're connected to people who will come after us as well. That's just so very important. And I took that with me during my time in public service. I thought, if you really want to be effective in serving the public, you can't just kind of know what inputs you're getting from your constituents right at this moment. You also have to have this deep understanding of what's happened before, whether it's the history of a particular policy issue or the history of a community that you're trying to represent. It really helps you to understand why where people may be coming from. If you know something about the history of a community, the history of a place, the history of of an environmental site, the history of a building, all of these things that contribute to our experience in a place.
So one of my questions was, because you spend years in elected office, was there anything there or a particular thing that convinced you that perhaps teaching history and civics might be just as important as making policy itself?
I really came to think of myself as a kind of civic educator when I was in public office. I would get invitations to go speak in elementary school classrooms, high school classrooms, college classes. I would host student groups down at the state capitol when they were visiting the state reception room. I'd go talk to them about the workings of state government. Um, and I would help citizens of all ages to navigate the legislative process and help to educate them about how that process worked. And so I really came to think of myself as a kind of civic educator. Also got to work on civic education as a policy issue. We passed a half credit civics graduation requirement in the state of Washington in 2018. And I became more and more convinced that if we don't get civic literacy right, if we don't take that extremely seriously, then you know none of the other issues are going to matter all that much, because our process is going to be dysfunctional. We're not going to have an understanding of what this enterprise is of self-government. And so I became convinced I got to work on that as an issue. I've got to commit my career to it. So left public service, and took up a job running the Jack Miller Center in 2022. The Jack Miller Center works on civic education by supporting college professors as force multipliers for civic literacy, not only working with undergraduates, but helping to equip K-12 teachers with primary source competency. And we're just generally interested in growing the movement for civic literacy. We started the National Summit on Civic Education in 2022, and just had our largest event ever, which was the 2026 summit for the 250th, and just almost 500 people in Philadelphia, educators, organization leaders, philanthropists, coming together to say we need to grow this movement for civics in our country. This is a critical issue. It can't just be one course that you take in middle school or a test that you pass in middle school, something like that. It's got to be this lifelong commitment to becoming competent as citizens, engaged as citizens, informed as citizens, and that's got to be taken seriously all throughout K-12 education. It's got to be taken seriously in higher education, and all of us need to take our civic formation at every stage of life seriously.
You kind of stole my thunder that one, because that was my question, was the core mission, right, of Jack Miller Center, which I think you gave. What does that look like in practice? What are the difficulties in trying to get that mission going?
Well, I think over the course of many decades, we have drifted toward economic competence as the primary paradigm of education in our country. And that's very understandable. It's almost, intuitive that that's just the way it ought to be, because we're so ingrained with this concept that economic competence is first and foremost. And parents want their kids to get a good job. When kids are choosing their majors in college, that's first and foremost in their mind. And yet the public purpose and the foremost purpose, in my opinion, of an education system ought to be the formation of citizens to govern a free society. You can't say, well, it's government over there that's going to take care of it, and I can go about my private life and not have to worry about the governance of our society. No, we're all responsible for the governance of our free society. And that requires deep education. The founders of our country understood that requires deep education. George Washington very, very much understood this. And he emphasized this repeatedly in his public speeches as president. In his first State of the Union address, he talked about civic education as this critically important thing in a free society. And he listed 6 different things that citizens need to be prepared to think about. And these aren't just how a bill becomes a law. I mean, that's important to understand too. But you need to know the difference, he said, between freedom and tyranny. You need to know about your responsibilities. You need to know about your rights. These are things that require deep thoughtfulness, not just kind of memorizing some things, but really deep thoughtfulness and an ability to deliberate together. That we have to be able to reach decisions uh, together, and that requires a certain set of skills that have to be cultivated, have to be practiced over time.
I always tell my students, what does democracy look like for you, and what makes you be participatory in this democracy? And they always start and stop with the same thing, which is vote. I'm like, actually, that's the most basic thing you
Mm,
could do, right? I'm like, participatory democracy means you truly participate in the democracy.
that's right.
That means, I tell my students in college, I'm like, you could run for office, you could join the school board, you could be part of the government. That's true participatory democracy. Voting is indeed, but that's the most basic level. You vote, you sit down, you go watch your TV show. Participating in democracy, that's the true intent, right,
That's right.
of our republic.
That's right. And when you think about self government, it's not just about what you do in government. It's also the many ways that we can make a difference for our fellow citizens through civil society. You've been very active in a historical society. That's one way that somebody can get involved and make a difference in their community. But somebody could join a PTA council. They could join their homeowners association. They could get involved in their house of worship governing board. There's just so many ways that, and most of the ways that people can get involved in public office are not going to be in Congress or even at the state level. They're going to be in these little local government jurisdictions, school boards, fire commissions, water commissions, this concurrence, overlapping kinds of districts and jurisdictions all across the country by which we govern ourselves. We need to take that very, very seriously if we're going to build up the kind of skill sets that are going to come in handy once somebody gets to Congress or once somebody becomes president. These are the kinds of practices that we have to cultivate and have to really prioritize. Um, you know, the stewardship of democracy requires deep preparation. It requires a commitment of our lives to getting involved. I mean, you look at the World War II generation and how they committed their lives, and for so many paid the ultimate sacrifice for the public good, for our country, for future generations. We have to recapture the spirit of service and sacrifice and the kind of character that goes with that. If we're going to have another 250 years, there's nothing guaranteed about this experiment in self-government.
So I guess the big question is, how do we go about doing that, right?
That's right. Well, I think, again, we have to have a paradigm shift in our education system toward the civic purpose of that education. That has to happen at every level. I would also say that those of us, who are in leadership roles can play a fundamental role in all of this. We can do that through example, and we can also rally our fellow citizens to get involved. I think there's a lot of people out there who are looking to get involved. They're just not sure where to start. So, whether you're involved with a historical society, whether you're involved with a Rotary Club, whether you're involved with, a neighborhood council, whatever it is, there are a lot of people around you who would get involved in that thing if you went out and tried to recruit them. One of my favorite things when I was in politics was getting other people involved in the political process. And there was a lot of joy to that because you could see people stepping up and realizing, wow, I can really make a difference in a very significant way.
It's interesting because there's this talk about a civic education crisis in the headlines, and almost, I guess the question is, what does that actually look like in a classroom, right? I mean, it's based on your research and talking to educators out there. What is the civic education crisis, as opposed to just a headline, but every day to day? What do they see? What are the issues that they're kind of encountering?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can measure the crisis in terms of test scores. The most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress, 13% proficiency in history, 22% proficiency in civics. So that's one indicator. I think there are indicators, and this is not a partisan statement of any kind, but I think regardless of what angle you're looking at our political process, you can say it is dysfunctional, and we're not dealing with one another in a very effective way. We're talking past each other. We are pitted against each other. Our social media and other forces are contributing to that. So it's not a civically healthy situation that we find ourselves in. But I think we're also disconnected from one another. I mean, I think that's as much as anything the most fundamental thing. So how do you sort of rebuild that sense of connectedness that we need to have as human beings, and then how do you empower people to really make a difference once they've built those connections? I think that's really the challenge in front of us. And that's a challenge for our educational institutions. It's a challenge for public leaders. It's a challenge for every business, every nonprofit, every civil society organization, and every family in this country to rise to the moment and say, we're going to address this together.
Hans, I was just as we were talking, I was thinking, because the challenge isn't always just that the students are not learning enough history. It might also be that they're learning differently than previous generations, right? Younger people learn differently. They take in information differently. It got me thinking of, when I was in a classroom, they used to take out the national, international reading month or whatever. They used to put these posters of these famous people, and it would say read, and you would have these actors sitting with a book. Or even like the got milk commercials, they would get famous people with the got milk. It's almost like the young people, and I'm not, don't just mean teenagers, but even in their 20s, they consume so much social media, they consume so much information that perhaps we're not putting these ideas in front of them in the right places. You know what I mean? Like, maybe there should be a campaign. Like, for my 15-year-old, who he considers a celebrity is not who I would consider a celebrity. He watches some YouTuber and he's like, oh, this guy's so famous, Dad. I'm like, I've never heard of this person, right? But maybe applying that and going where the young people are, where they already are going and learning from, for better or for worse, and trying to put those lessons in those
Mhm.
spaces, connect with those people that already have that attention, I
I
guess,
do
of young
think there
people.
is a real hunger in the younger generation for wisdom.
Yep.
And there are signs, even with some of the influencers, you might call them, who are sharing wisdom, or I think that's what's motivating young people to seek after that. And um, I think a lot of young people, for example, what I think about a lot in the collegiate setting is that a lot of people might go and become political science majors thinking that they're going to gain political wisdom, and they're actually getting a lot of information but not a lot of wisdom. And so how do we bring wisdom back into our educational process? That's a controversial thing, really, when you come down to it, because the kind of scientific method that has become the predominant thing throughout the academic disciplines, that has made research the force motive of academia, has taken away, I think, a lot of the motivation for something like citizen formation, or the idea that we would need to cultivate a rising generation of statesmen and stateswomen who are going to be governing our society in the future. Well, it turns out that we need some kind of formative function like that, and so higher education should take that seriously, and disciplines like political science should take that seriously. Historians should also see the importance that they have in teaching the rising generation about historical lessons and deriving wisdom. Again, using that term wisdom, I think we need to recapture a sense of that in our educational process.
Yeah, I think it's sad that so many universities are kind of curtailing their humanities, their history majors specifically. It's that same thing for education. When I teach an entry level course, beginning of the semester, I'm always like, who here is a history major? Nobody. Okay, who here is an education major? Nobody. It's like, who here is a business major? Like two-thirds, and the rest is nurses. It's like, how do I get these? It's almost like you want to grab these kids before they get to that point. But then we also have the issue with, when you think of higher education, I feel like universities are now caught between pursuing history, or what could be considered a truth, really, and responding to political pressure, right? I assume that also has a lot of impact on how civic education is being taught.
There is definitely the politicization of topics like civics and history that make them a kind of minefield. But it turns out that the vast majority of, say, parents uh, have a kind of baseline of what they want their kids to learn in school about civics. We polled parents about this a few years ago and found that the vast majority of parents across political divides think that their kid ought to get an education in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the responsibilities of citizenship. So there's a starting point there that some things we can agree on that ought to be up for discussion. Doesn't mean we have to agree on all of it, but it means we have to that there's some things that we can rally around, some reference points that we can hold in common. And I think it's important to name those founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, because we need a society that is specifically literate in those documents. I'm glad there's been so much attention with the 250th celebration to the Declaration of Independence, to the text of the Declaration and the history of the Declaration. But I also think that historical documents, when we focus on the texts of those documents, they allow us to step outside of the current moment, the current partisan divides, and other ways that we might be polarized, by saying, okay, let's have a conversation about what this document is saying. Again, doesn't mean we have to agree on it. We can have a debate about it. We can cultivate skill sets for maybe being able to work through contemporary issues based on what we're learning about how we can have civil conversations and talking about primary source readings. So a social studies classroom at the K-12 level, or a political science classroom, or history classroom at the university level can be phenomenally powerful in being able to give us skill sets for working through contemporary issues.
We often think and talk about civic knowledge, but what about civic character? Would you say those two things are inseparable?
I think they are absolutely linked. Some in the civics world like to talk about the kind of three parts of a good civic education, which are civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic dispositions or virtues. So we absolutely have to cultivate that kind of character, and that is necessary for governing ourselves together, for being able to work through problems, for being able to respect the rule of law, for being willing to care for the people around us and take responsibility for the things that are close to us, and to be able to serve when our country calls us, when our community calls us. These are absolutely critical, and we have to celebrate them. We have to teach them proactively.
You've written about citizens needing to think like a king in a republic. Can you elaborate on that concept?
Well, there's, that was a book review that I wrote of a book about the teaching of statesmanship. And, there have been what's been called the mirror for princes tradition, where, sages and, kind of retired, politicians throughout history have given wisdom to the rising generation of politicians and kings and other leaders. And, we need to be conscious in cultivating the rising generation of statespersons in our free society. We need to take statesmanship seriously, and not just in terms of, I think we often think of something like statesmanship, we think grand strategy, and you want people who are responsible practitioners of statesmanship at that level, but you also want people who take statesmanship seriously in, running a nonprofit organization, running a business that has engagement with the community, in serving in a state office or in Congress. We need people exercising statesmanship in all of these places. And again, I go back to this idea of teaching wisdom, and that is very much tied to the teaching of character. And I think the founding generation would say, that character or virtue is tied to our sense of happiness as a people. They saw those things really as inseparable. If you look at Jeffrey Rosen's book called "The Pursuit of Happiness," it's a masterclass study in the founding generation and how they understood virtue and the kind of things that they read about virtue from the classical tradition, the Enlightenment tradition, and how that shaped their understanding of a phrase like the pursuit of happiness that we find in the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, I had Jeffrey on the show. He actually talked about that. It was a great conversation. Do you think that the disagreements that we are having as a people about history are a sign of civic decline, or really just evidence that people still care deeply about their country's story?
I think it's both, because there are times where we use, our interpretation of history as a bludgeon for whatever the other side is, to us. Um, but then there are times where we engage in good faith discussions about the meaning of our history, the interpretation of our history, and that's important. That's necessary. We have to wrestle with who we are as a people, about the good parts of our story that we can be grateful for, and about the parts of our story that we need to grow from. Um, and history can be absolutely dynamic for the present as we do our part to shape the future. Um, and we absolutely have to have a historical consciousness, a sense of the past, whether that is a sense of our own community, our local community past, or whether it is the sense of the past of the nation. And I think this 250th anniversary season that we've been in has really been a time for us to reflect on the meaning of our country as a whole, not only where we have been, but where we're going. And I hope that we come through this more hopeful and also resolved to think about the generational work that lies ahead of us to build a movement for civic purpose. That's going to require this paradigm shift towards civics in our schools. It's going to require this recommitment to one another as fellow citizens, as fellow community members, who share something very, very meaningful and valuable in common.
So I guess my last question, 250th is a perfect springboard for all this because it draws attention to civics and history. At least from what I remember, this is the most that I've seen everyone being
Mm,
engaged about our nation's history in my
mhm.
lifetime. I wasn't alive in '76, so this is it for me. But what is what is Jack Miller Center thinking of doing to use this moment going forward? Like how can your organization use this as a springboard to not just end with 250th,
Right.
but look forward?
Yeah, we just got through, as I said, our national summit on civic education, and we're planning our next summit in 2027. And we want that to be just an annual, not only 2-day event for us, but something around which people can rally as we build a coalition and a movement for civics. And we're putting our next strategic plan together. We're thinking about how can we provide um, you know, incredibly higher levels of support for college professors who are focused on civics, who are building programs for civics on their campuses, who are designing groundbreaking, kind of innovative new programs for the K-12 teaching force to help instill content mastery in K-12 civics and history teachers. And we want a new generation of academic entrepreneurs and builders who are going to go in and reclaim the civic purpose of our universities. There are a number of new civics programs at public universities that are taking shape, some of them at large scale. Programs at the University of Florida, University of Texas Austin, University of Tennessee Knoxville. There are 5 programs like this in Ohio, but there are a number of new innovative programs happening in private higher education as well at Johns Hopkins University and Stanford University, Yale University, and that's just scratching the surface of some of the conversations that are now happening within academia that were not happening just 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So there's a lot of new energy. within academia. I would say there's a lot of new public policy energy around civics at the K-12 level. There have been a number of bills introduced and passed in state legislatures to enhance civics instruction. So I think we need to take all of that to the next level and say we need a total recommitment to our country, to understanding it, to its civic purposes, and to shaping wise and effective citizens for the future.
Hans, this was an awesome, very enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks for all you do.